Hey everyone, how's it going today? And welcome to another episode. So, the big update to share that most people already know by now, but if you are not familiar with the news, to break it out to every single person, is that President Donald Trump's brand new big beautiful bill, some people are calling it a tax bill because there are a lot of tax policies in it, obviously. Some people are even calling it a stimulus bill because they believe it's meant to stimulate the economy. But probably the most common name is that most people are simply just calling it his one big beautiful bill. Well, the story in the breaking news is that this bill has now officially been approved in its entirety. So it was approved in Congress, it was approved in the House, it was approved in the Senate, and now it was officially approved and signed on President Biden's desk. Sorry, not President Biden, President Donald Trump's desk. I know I'm still a little in the past, right? But the idea really is that if you need the background story to what's going on is that essentially it was approved first inside the Senate on Tuesday at a vote of 51 to 50. So it technically actually tied. In the beginning, it was voted on a vote of 50 to 50, but then the tiebreaker became J.D. Vance, who is the vice president, who basically voted in favor of the bill because obviously he supports this because this is Donald Trump's bill. So he basically approved of that bill. It was approved in the Senate at a vote of 51 to 50. 2 days later, it went to the House on Thursday. It was approved at a vote of 218 to 214. And finally, it made its way to President Trump's desk on Friday of July 4th, where it was completely approved in its entirety. So it barely got approved, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, an approval is an approval. And so the big idea is that in today's video, what I really want to talk about is really just highlighting the details to what exactly is inside of this bill. I want to try to break it down into simplified terms, so even if you've seen another video, hopefully there's still something to get out of this one. And then I also want to maybe just talk a little bit about the significance of this in the most unbiased way possible, so we can kind of give the facts to what's actually happening when it comes to this bill and how this is going to be impacting all of us and our daily lives, because there are a lot of areas and a lot of changes that also happened as a result of this bill. If you don't know the other story behind this one, is that essentially there was originally one version of this bill. There were many versions, but the two latest versions of this bill, one of the versions was the bill that originally went through the House and then went into the Senate. However, in the Senate, they modified this bill. So that's why even if you've seen another video about this, there were still some modifications that were made, which we're going to talk about in today's video. So with that being said, let's just get right to this video. But as always, if you guys enjoy videos like this, before we begin, if you guys want to share some support, consider liking, commenting, subscribing. Maybe feel free to share any thoughts down below about your thoughts about this bill or any policies within this bill, whether you support it, you don't support it, your personal thoughts. And as always, consider subscribing, hitting the bell as we get more information to share as well. So with that said, let's get started. So the first policy that we're really going to talk about, oh, and by the way, I'm also going to drop some timestamps down in the bottom, so feel free to skip around if there's a particular policy you really want to focus on. But we're going to start by going through them all in order. And the first policy we're going to talk about is pretty much going to be Donald Trump's tax cuts. So essentially the story is that this one's very, very straightforward, but essentially back in 2017, he approved several tax cut policies that were helped to reduce taxes for a lot of people in our country. However, those policies or those tax cuts were set to expire by the very, very end of this year, so specifically the end of 2025. And so under this new approved bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill, what's going to happen now is that those tax cuts will now officially become permanent. And that's one of the biggest things about this. So what's really, really great is that if you are someone that do support these tax cuts, then now you don't have to worry about this, because in the future, it's now officially a permanent thing. Unless someone in the future decides to essentially approve a policy to revoke or to reverse these tax cuts, without that happening, these tax cuts, they're going to be existing for now a very, very, we'll just say an indefinite period of time until someone takes action otherwise. But that's really the straightforward answer to the first one. Now, the second policy that we really have to talk about is going to be several policies that we're going to combine into one, and it has to deal with border security, defense, so military related stuff, and also energy. So the big idea behind what's going on is that essentially he is going to be increasing spending in these three specific areas. So border security, defense and military, and then energy. In energy and military specifically, so more than more than $46.5 billion with a B, so again, billion dollars, will be used to construct the border or to increase border security in our country. $45 billion will be used for immigrants in custody, and $30 billion will be used for funding, hiring, and training resources for the U.S. Immigration Customs. And then there's also, when it comes to the energy side of things, is that he is going to be removing a lot of the energy plans. So specifically what this means is that one of the policies that's within this policy has to pretty much do with electric vehicles. Before this bill was approved, there was a policy that essentially gave you some tax credits or tax benefits to buying an electric vehicle. So this was to help support clean energy. So for example, if you wanted to buy a Tesla, this was an incentive, or at least the policy before this one was an incentive to get it because of the tax benefits that would come out of it. However, he did remove this tax policy. So one of the not so good news is that if you were someone that was looking to buy an electric vehicle, for example, a Tesla in this example, then it does mean that he's basically voiding it so that no longer this will apply. So that is one very, very relative downside news to what's going on, at least when it comes to this specific policy. So the idea is increased spending, but several policies being removed. And that's the big takeaway from this one. Now, the next policy that we have to talk about is actually going to be one that I know is probably not going to be very good news for a lot of people, but it is something that's relatively important to share, which is why, again, there are some policies you might really support, and there are some policies maybe you don't really support. But feel free to leave your comments down below because I'd love to hear them from you guys. And it's always just great to hear from you guys in general anyway. But the next policy we're going to have to talk about is going to be related to Medicaid and SNAP benefits. Some people are talking about this as two separate policies because they are technically two separate programs. But what's happening to Medicaid is very similar to what's happening to SNAP benefits. And the long story short is behind this one is that they are trying to plan to cut or to reduce the amount of money that will be used to fund these programs. So why is this particularly bad news for a lot of people is that because if you are someone that is on Medicaid or someone that is collecting food stamps, and I totally relate there because I know that when I started this channel in the beginning, I was also an unemployed soul that was collecting Medicaid, that was on Medicaid and collecting SNAP benefits, food stamps during that time period. So I totally relate to a lot of people there because I was someone that lived out those times as a lot of people did. Well, under this new policy, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of budget cuts to these areas, which means that it's going to potentially remove or certainly reduce the amount of coverage that Medicaid will be able to cover and the amount of money that will be used for SNAP benefits. So how this relates to it is that, long story short, is that they have estimated that over the next 10 years, because of this cut, potentially about 11.8 million people in our country will either lose or see some kind of reduction in coverage when it comes to their health insurance plans. And we already know right now is that in our country, health insurance, and this isn't even from an article, this is just from personal experience, is that health insurance, as we probably know, most Americans know, is that it's really expensive in our country. You know, you can sometimes have the sake of like some health related situation can sometimes set you back several years financially because of how expensive it is to pay for things. Well, now, because of the reduction with Medicaid and SNAP benefits, it's expected to actually worsen. So this is actually one of the policies that I think is that most people will not enjoy and certainly find very, very difficult to maybe take in, but it is what it is. And I think that that's why it's important to maybe feel free to share your thoughts about what you think about this specific policy and situation. Okay, the next policy that we have to talk about is really about the state and local tax deduction, so otherwise known as SALT. This one's very, very straightforward. So all you really have to know about this one is that they're going to be raising it from 10K to 40K for the next several years before reducing it back down to 10K again. So this is one of the policies where I think they're trying to try it out a little bit. So it's not a permanent policy such as like the tax cuts that we talked about earlier in this video, but it is something that is happening. but it is specifically just this specific policy is going to be relatively temporary, only lasting for a couple of years, which is why we're not going to be spending as much time focused talking about it. Now, the next policy that we really have to talk about is going to be related to the one really big one that I know a lot of people care about, and it's going to be about no taxes to tips and no taxes to overtime pay. So this one, what you really have to know about essentially is that what's really going on with this specific policy is that it's only going to last until about 2028. So it's only going to be about a 3-year program with changes that actually did happen in the original House bill. So this is one area where even if you've seen another video related to this, there were some changes that happened. In the original bill that went through the House, it was uncapped, meaning that it was unlimited how much you could potentially be untaxed when it comes to tipped income and overtime pay. Well, what ended up happening is that once the bill entered through the House and then went into the Senate, they modified the bill once more again in this final version. And in the final version, so in the Senate version of this bill, which is the one that actually officially got approved, it will now be capped at $25,000. So originally the House part also made a limit where they were going to cap things and only have this program be implemented for people making $160,000 or less, which is probably going to be most people watching this video because most people in our country do make $160,000 or less. While in the new Senate bill, they're going to be now limiting this to $150,000 for single individuals and $300,000 for couples. So this is the part that's going to be relatively interesting that I think is going to apply to a lot of people. I think this one is probably going to be relatively great news for a lot of people because there's a lot of people that work very long hours in our country and hope to have less, tax when it comes to overtime pay, and hopefully also have less taxes when it comes to tipped income. But it is just something really important to be able to share because this one actually did go through some changes. But the approved version, like the final approved version, there's now going to be a cap. But the cap at least is a very high number. It's $25,000, which is going to be a lot of money. And I think that's the really great news about it. Now, the next tax policy that we have to talk about is going to be related to something for children and kids. And this has to do with the child tax credit. So how this one is related is essentially currently right now at the time of the making of this video, before this bill got approved, it was currently stood at $2,000 in the child tax credit, and it was in danger of returning back to the original level from Trump's first term of $1,000 in 2026. Well, what is going on now is that essentially is that this tax credit, so what was approved under this brand new bill is now going to increase it to $2,200, so $2.2K. This was actually also something that was changed from the originally House passed bill, because in the original bill that was approved in the House and sent to the Senate before modifications happened, they wanted to raise it from $2K to $2.5K, so $2,500. But then what happened was that once it got into the Senate, they felt that this was going to be maybe a little bit too generous or too much money. So as a result, they found a middle ground, and now instead it's going to be modified. And so in the approved version, what actually officially went through, it's going to now be changed and adjusted from $2,000 to $2,200. So if you are someone that is trying to raise a family, if you are someone that has kids under the age of 18, this is going to be a little bit of some great news because it is going to now potentially put more money in our pockets. But it's a little bit difficult to say, and that's why, and the reason why it's a little bit difficult is that because and this is the part that's interesting, but we're going to definitely have to make a future video going into more details about this. So if you are hopefully finding some insight in this video so far, maybe consider subscribing if you guys haven't done so already. But the idea is that as some people benefit from some of these policies, there will be other people that will also be hurt in indirect ways from other policies as well. It's going to sound a little complicated, so we're not going to go into as many details. I think this is something I really want to explore in a future video where I talk about the more in-depth look about how this is going to impact our economy. But the big takeaway is that these are probably just the main different areas of the many areas that a country is going to now potentially be changed because of these approved programs. Everything such as things from like SNAP benefits, Medicaid, tipped income, overtime pay, Social Security, taxes, tax cuts, tax policies, child tax credits. Hopefully this is going to give a big overview of all the different policies. Now, I do want to end this video by maybe sharing some personal thoughts about where we're going to go from here is that there are a lot of talks right now that although this is going to be relatively some great news for obviously a population of people, it is obviously also going to be some actually pretty bad news for a very big population of people. But one thing that is expected to be impacted is that because of a lot of the policies in this bill, they are expected that it's going to increase the debt crisis, which ultimately means that inflation will worsen. So regardless is that even if you are someone that will benefit to have some extra money in your pockets, it is expected that because of a lot of these things that are happening, more money printing, more easier monetary policy, everything going on there, it is expected that inflation might potentially worsen even further than what it already is going on right now, which means prices will increase and get further. So it means the value of the dollar may not be as strong as it once was. This is something that's very in-depth that I would love to explore in a future video, so maybe consider subscribing if you guys haven't done so already, because we're definitely going to be touching up that in a future video to hopefully clarify and make sense of everything that's happening right now. But with that being said, that's pretty much what I really just wanted to share in today's video. So if you guys found that relatively insightful, as always, consider liking, smashing the like button, subscribing, hitting the bell. Feel free to leave a comment about your personal thoughts, whether you like, you dislike. Would love to get a discussion going. And with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, stay safe, stay well, and hope to see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much again.